Okay. Hi, guys. Apologize if that was kind of awkward in the beginning. I'm using the Loom software that a lot of your teachers are using, but I'm still learning how to use it. And I think it may have started recording before I thought it did. So, apologies if there was an awkward time there. You can't edit Loom videos or I would cut it out. So, what we're going to do today is I am going to read to you what I gave you yesterday because I know that it was a lot of information, but I want you to practice reading in English because since you're in 10th grade, you need to be able to read something that's this complicated in English in case you decide to go to a university where they speak English, or in case you want to get a job when you graduate that requires you to be able to read and speak English. So I make you guys read more complicated things a lot of times just because I want to make sure that you're prepared for whenever you leave Montreal and go do whatever it is you're going to go do. But since this one has a lot of big words and a lot of stuff going on in it, I wanted to also read it to you. Because if we were in class, I would be able to come around and help you with stuff you didn't know. So this is kind of a way for me to be able to do that even though we're not in class. So I apologize if I pronounce any of these names wrong. We don't speak the same language these people did. And so there are going to be words that I say that maybe if you listen to someone else say them, they say them differently, or maybe I say them wrong. I try my best, but sometimes. All right, so we're going to start reading together. So if you would like to read along with me, that would be excellent. I think that you can see my mouse on this. So if you can, we're going to start up here and just come all the way down. Babylonia, the rise of Babylonia. One Akkadian town that developed in approximately 1900 BC was the small town of Babylon, located by the Euphrates River. Babylon grew in size and importance, and eventually its ruler, King Hammurabi, conquered all of Mesopotamia. This kingdom came to be known as Babylonia. The Babylonian culture was similar to the Sumerian culture, which had existed in Mesopotamia before the Babylonians arrived. In fact, many people refer to the Babylonians as just a later development of the Sumerian culture, which, while the two civilizations existed at different times, they had many things in common. The Babylonians adopted the religion, literature, inventions, practices of the Sumerians. Scholars and priests spoke the Sumerian language, although most Babylonians did not. Babylonia did make one important contribution of its own to the world. This contribution was a code of laws known as the Code of Hammurabi. So before we read on, I'm going to talk about a few things. So the first thing is right here. I almost pointed at the screen. This picture right here is the Gate of Ishtar. This is one of the most famous things about Babylonia. I highly recommend you Google it because it's beautiful in color. Unfortunately, the book I got this out of, it is in black and white, and I can only print pictures in black and white. Maybe I'll try and find some pictures to show you and post them for you. This is one of the things that they created using that art style and the information they had and the religion of the Sumerians. That's why last week we looked a lot at Sumerians and what their culture was like and what their religion was like and how they built things. We spent so much time on Sumer so that you guys could understand the other cultures we talk about because they kind of build on what the Sumerians did. All right, so let's start reading about the Code of Hammurabi right here. The Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was king of Babylonia from 1792 to 1750 BC. He was a powerful leader with strong armies. He expanded Babylon by conquering other kingdoms. Hammurabi was also an efficient administrator. Hammurabi was not just concerned with his own comfort. He was also concerned with the lives of all people in his kingdom. He wanted everyone in his kingdom to have enough food, adequate housing, and to be treated fairly. In order to make sure that everyone was treated fairly, he had his scribes draw up a code of laws that are known as the Code of Hammurabi. Many of the laws were borrowed from written laws of the Sumerians. Hammurabi's code was a little different from the laws devised by the Sumerians, however. Hammurabi's code added the element of revenge. In Sumeria, most who committed a crime were fined. The Code of Hammurabi did not impose a fine on criminals, but substituted the ancient punishment of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. In other words, if someone did something bad to a person, in many cases the court would do the same thing to the wrongdoer. So what that means when it's talking about fines is like money that you have to pay. So you have to give the court a certain amount of money to make up for whatever crime you did, instead of actually being punished. That's why on Monday I told you guys that there weren't really laws like we think of them today, because usually when we think of doing something bad, we think of going to jail and possibly having a death sentence or having some sort of punishment for whatever we did. So the Sumerians didn't really do that. You just kind of paid money and you moved on. So let's keep reading down here where it says some laws. Some laws in the code seem very extreme and cruel. For example, if a son slapped his father, the son's hands would be cut off. If a man killed another man's son, then his son would be killed. While this may seem harsh by today's standards, before the code was written and followed, punishment was often decided by priests and judges who imposed punishments even more harsh. Death was a common punishment for even the most minor offenses. So these laws were not meant to be cruel, just to be fair. So in the time in between the Sumerians and their fines and Hammurabi writing this code down, they just would kill you, is what they mean here. So really quickly, before we go on, we're going to read this little box here, because this ends in the middle of a sentence. So we're not going to come back to this. We're just going to move on to the next one. So let's read this really quickly. Babylonian civilization at a glance. Where? On the Euphrates River. So that's where it's located. When? From about 2000 to 1155 BC. So I told you guys this before, but I'm going to remind you again. A lot of times dates in history are different because we're not exactly sure when it happened, because we weren't there and they weren't keeping track of time the same way we are. We'll talk about this in several weeks. It'll be several topics away. But eventually we'll talk about the fact that before the Roman Empire, their months and their year were different than our current months and year. During the Roman Empire, one of the Roman emperors changes and adds things and makes a more uniform calendar that we all kind of start following later on in the future. So that's why sometimes our dates are a little bit different, and sometimes I'll tell you one thing and then you'll read something different. It doesn't mean that I'm wrong or that the text is wrong. It just means that we're not completely sure when it happened. And maybe the dates I learned in college or the dates that I get out of another book are different than the dates that are in this book. So that's just a thing to keep in mind as we read about ancient civilizations. So, a few achievements they did. We're actually going to skip the achievements Obviously, you've probably read them by now, but we're going to skip them for now because we're going to talk about them in just a second. So let's move on. We're going to read this last passage, and then I'm going to pull up the next section. So the code, it did not distinguish between classes of people. So remember, we talked about classes and how there are upper classes and lower classes. A person's punishment depended on who was wronged. Right? Let me make this big so you can see it. For example, if a man put out the eye of another man, his eye would be put out. But if he put out the eye of a freedman, someone who was a former slave, he would pay 1 gold mina. If he put out the eye of a man's slave, then he would have to pay 1/2 of the slave's value. So this was during a time when they had a lot of slavery, because if your family was poor, you could go into slavery to give your family money. Usually whenever they took over a city, whenever they went to war, they would take the soldiers and keep them as slaves and some of the other people. So this was during a time where there was a lot of slavery. So the next section is called astronomy. Law was not the only interest of the Babylonians. They studied astronomy and also believed in astrology. Astronomy is the study of the universe, including the movement of the stars and planets. Astrology is the belief that positions and movements of the planets and stars can affect and predict life on Earth. While we separate these two areas today, the Babylonians did not. So they studied the stars and looked at the constellations, but they also believed that the stars and the constellations and the planets affected how things happen here on Earth. So if you're still confused about what astrology is, I know you've probably heard of it before. It's the star signs. So things like Aquarius, Sagittarius, Gemini, those kinds of things. So let's keep reading. The Babylonians not only watched the stars and the heavens, they kept record of the events such as when an eclipse occurred. They were able to measure time by studying the movements of the celestial bodies, so the planets. The priests used their knowledge of planets and stars as part of their religion. The priests claimed that by studying the celestial bodies, they could tell the future. They were constantly looking at the skies, making horoscopes and predictions based on what they saw. So a horoscope is a prediction of a person's future based on a diagram of the planets and stars at a given moment, such as their birth. So this is something that we still see today. People still do this. A lot of people do it for fun now instead of actually believing it, but there are still people who believe that your horoscope can predict your future. It's silly stuff like telling you, like, are you going to have a good day today? What's going to happen to you this week? A lot of Christians believe that we should avoid those things because it tells us to in the Bible, but there are some people who think that it's just kind of fun and silly. It's something that we still see today, and it's interesting to know that it came from these people. So the next section is Nebuchadnezzar II. About 1,000 years after the death of Hammurabi, King Nebuchadnezzar II came to power. By this time, Babylon was part of the Chaldean. I believe you pronounce it Chaldean. That's one of those ones I'm not sure about. I've heard it said a few different ways. The Chaldean Empire, which came to power after the Assyrian Empire was destroyed. We'll talk about the Assyrians later. Nebuchadnezzar ruled Babylon from 605 to 562 BC. Under his leadership, Babylon grew. At this time, Babylon had two structures that were so impressive they were known throughout the entire civilized world. The first was a beautifully decorated wall surrounding Babylon. On the top of the wall, there were towers for guards who could watch for approaching enemies. This wall was wide enough for a 4-horse chariot to drive on. The most impressive gate in the wall was the Gate of Ishtar. Ishtar was a goddess, and the gate was named in her honor, was made of colorful glazed enamel bricks with pictures of animals. The gate was so beautiful that at one time it was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was later replaced on this list by the Lighthouse of Alexandria. So that's that gate we looked at in the last one, the picture. I'm going to try and remember to post some pictures for you. I may forget. If I do, Google it. It's so pretty, and we still have parts of it that you can actually go to museums and see. I want to say that it moves, it goes from one museum to another. When I learned about it in college, it was in Rome, I think. But I think that it's part of an exhibit that they transport from one country to another a lot of times so that more people can see it. So this wall is also probably one of the walls they talk about in the Bible. In Psalms, they talk about the walls of Babylon a lot. So this is probably something you've heard about before, or at least heard mentioned. All right, let's read about the second thing. The second structure was built by Nebuchadnezzar to gain worldwide fame. It was the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Hanging Gardens is still considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was built to please Nebuchadnezzar's wife, Amytis. That's another one, I'm not sure. It was a building. It consisted of several terraces with one above the other, so stacked. Each terrace was planted with trees and flowers from around the country. Pools and fountains were also built in this structure. The Babylonians developed an irrigation system to raise water from the Euphrates River to the gardens. Exactly how this irrigation system worked is unknown, but later writers referred to the system as a water engine. Nebuchadnezzar was replaced by his son in 1562 BC, who was assassinated 3 years later. Within a few years, Babylon was invaded by the Persians, and Babylon became part of the Persian Empire. So this is a lot of information to tell you that Babylon was super powerful and super important. All right? They built a lot of impressive things. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are something that still confuse us today because we don't understand how they could build something that took water up before we had invented electricity. That's another thing that you should Google and look at. We have models that show us how we think that it worked, and it's really cool to think about. It's also very funny to think about the fact that it says that he built it to appease his wife, to please his wife. So sometimes when boys make you mad, they buy you flowers. Sometimes when boys make you mad, they have to build you a big fancy pyramid. Nebuchadnezzar took it to a very different level than we do now. So these are some things that are important about Babylon and that also will help us understand other cultures in the future. So tomorrow you'll have some questions to go with this. You can obviously look back at it to see where things are. You can take notes on this, whatever you need to do. So I just wanted to read it to you so that you could see it and hear it, because I know that helps a lot of times, especially with big words like Nebuchadnezzar and things like that. There are a lot of names here I know that probably throw you off a little bit because they throw me off when I read them in Spanish. So just wanted to read it to you to make sure that you understand it. If you have any questions, let me know. I apologize if this video isn't the best. I'm still learning how to use Loom, so I'm going to watch this back and try and figure out how to fix it next time. But thank you for watching, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow.